When my son Michael handed me that shiny new smartphone and said, "Mom, this will keep you busy," I could hear the unspoken words hanging in the air like humidity on a July afternoon. What he really meant was, "This will keep you quiet." What he didn't know was that I'd been quiet for far too long, and that little device in my weathered hands was about to change everything. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Dorothy Martinez, but everyone calls me Dot. I'm 68 years old, and for the past 3 years, I've been living in what my son generously calls the guest quarters of his duplex here in Corpus Christi, Texas. The guest quarters, if you want to know the truth, is a converted garage with a kitchenette that barely fits a hot plate and a mini fridge that sounds like a dying cat when it kicks on at night. The walls are thin enough that I can hear every argument, every late-night television show, and every time my daughter-in-law Ashley tells the kids to keep it down because Grandma Dot is trying to rest. Rest. As if that's all I'm good for anymore. I wasn't always someone who lived in converted spaces and tiptoed around other people's schedules. For 32 years, I managed the cafeteria at Flower Bluff Elementary School. I knew every child's name, their allergies, which ones needed an extra helping because they wouldn't get dinner at home, and which ones tried to trade their vegetables for dessert when they thought I wasn't looking. I was the one who remembered birthdays with a special cookie, who kept emergency quarters for kids who forgot their lunch money, and who stayed late every Friday to prep for the next week because I understood that feeding children was about more than just food. When I retired 5 years ago, they threw me a party in the very cafeteria where I'd spent most of my adult life. The walls were decorated with construction paper flowers made by students, and Principal Johnson gave a speech about how I'd touched thousands of lives, one meal at a time. They presented me with a framed photo of all the staff and a gift card to the local grocery store. "For all those home-cooked meals you'll finally have time to make," the card said. Everyone laughed, and I smiled and thanked them, but inside I felt something cold settle in my chest, as if the only value I'd ever had was in feeding others. My husband Carlos died 2 years into my retirement. Pancreatic cancer took him fast, which everyone said was a blessing, but I wasn't sure who it was supposed to be a blessing for. One day he was complaining about indigestion, and 6 months later I was standing in Seaside Memorial Cemetery, watching them lower a casket into ground that was too hard and too dry, just like everything else had become. After the funeral, Michael sat me down at my kitchen table, the same table where Carlos and I had shared breakfast every morning for 43 years, and explained why I couldn't live alone anymore. He used words like practical and safe and family, but what he meant was that I'd become a liability. The house was too big, the bills too expensive, the upkeep too much for someone my age. He never asked what I wanted. He never asked if I felt unsafe or if I needed help. He simply decided, and I simply went along with it because that's what I'd been trained to do my entire life. The duplex sat on Leopard Street, about 15 minutes from the beach if you drove straight down Ocean Drive, but you could barely smell the salt air from our neighborhood. Michael and Ashley lived in the main house with my grandchildren, Tyler and Emma, while I occupied the smaller unit attached to the back. It had its own entrance, which Ashley pointed out repeatedly as if it were some grand luxury rather than a way to keep me separate from their real life. "You'll have your own space, Mom," Michael had said when we first walked through it. "Your own privacy." Privacy. Another word that meant something different, when you were the one being given it versus the one choosing it. The apartment itself was sparse. A fold-out couch that served as my bed, a small round table with 2 mismatched chairs, and a bathroom with a shower that never quite got hot enough. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. I'd brought a few things from the house, my jewelry box with the music-dancing ballerina that Carlos had given me for our first anniversary, some photographs in frames that didn't quite fit the space, and my collection of recipe cards written in my mother's careful cursive. Most of my life, though, had been donated or sold or simply left behind because there wasn't room for it in this new, smaller version of existence. The first few months weren't terrible. I helped with the children when Ashley worked her shifts at the medical clinic downtown. I cooked dinner most evenings, standing over the stove in their kitchen because mine could barely handle boiling water. I kept the house clean, did laundry, and tried to be useful without being intrusive. I thought I was contributing, I thought I was earning my place. But slowly, things began to shift. Ashley started making comments about groceries, about how much food disappeared when there were extra people in the house. She began buying different brands, cheaper ones. And when I offered to chip in more for household expenses, she'd wave me off with a tight smile that never reached her eyes. "We're managing just fine, Dot. You don't need to worry about anything." The phrase, "don't worry about anything," became a regular refrain. Don't worry about the leaky faucet in my bathroom. Don't worry about the fact that the air conditioning didn't reach my unit. Don't worry about why I wasn't included in family discussions about vacation plans or school events or even what to have for dinner. I was housed, I was fed, I was safe. What more could an old woman want? Tyler and Emma, who had once run to greet me with hugs and stories about their day, began treating me like furniture. Not maliciously, but with the casual indifference children show toward things that have always been there. I became background noise, the grandmother who watched them after school until Ashley got home, who helped with homework at the kitchen table while they scrolled through their tablets, who reminded them to brush their teeth and pack their backpacks. "Grandma Dot, where's my science project?" Emma would call out, not looking up from her phone. "Grandma Dot, Tyler's being mean to me," would echo from the living room. "Grandma Dot, can you make me a sandwich?" Became as common as, "Grandma Dot, turn down your TV, we're trying to watch a movie." I realized that I had become a service, not a person. I was useful, efficient, and forgettable. I kept their lives running smoothly, but I wasn't part of the life I was maintaining. The final straw came on a Tuesday in March, when Ashley announced that they were having Michael's coworkers over for a barbecue. She spent all morning cleaning the house, rearranging furniture, and preparing food. I offered to help, but she politely declined. "Actually, Dot," she said, not meeting my eyes, "it might be better if you just stayed in your apartment tonight. You know how it is with work people. They'll want to talk shop, and it'll probably be pretty boring for you." I nodded and smiled because that's what I always did, but something inside me broke a little more. I watched from my window as cars pulled into the driveway, as laughter and conversation filled the backyard, as my son grilled burgers and told stories to people who didn't know I existed. I sat on my fold-out couch eating a peanut butter sandwich for dinner, listening to the sounds of a party I wasn't invited to in my own family's backyard. That's when Michael's solution to my loneliness arrived in the form of a brand new smartphone. "I thought this might help you stay connected," he said, presenting it to me the next morning with the kind of pride usually reserved for solving major problems. "You can call us, text, maybe even video chat with Tyler and Emma when we're not around." Ashley nodded enthusiastically. "There are games on there too, and you can watch videos. It'll give you something to do." Something to do? As if my problem was boredom rather than invisibility. Michael spent about 10 minutes showing me the basics. How to turn it on, how to make a call, how to send a text message. His explanations were simplified, the way you might talk to a small child, or someone who'd never seen technology before. He spoke slowly and repeated himself, assuming that my 68-year-old brain couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of a device that millions of teenagers operated without thinking. "Don't worry if you can't figure it all out right away, Mom," he said, patting my shoulder. "These things can be pretty complicated. Just use it for calling us if you need anything." After he left, I sat holding that phone for a long time. It was sleek and black, much fancier than the old flip phone I'd used for years. The screen was bright and responsive, and when I touched it, little icons appeared like magic. For a moment, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. Curiosity. But then I heard Ashley's voice through the thin walls, talking to someone on her own phone. "Oh, we got Michael's mom a smartphone," she was saying, and I could hear the amusement in her tone. "Can you imagine? She can barely work the remote control, but Michael thinks she'll figure out texting. It's sweet, really. It'll keep her busy for a while, and maybe she'll stop asking us what we're doing all the time." The laughter that followed felt like a slap. That night, I sat at my small table with the phone in front of me, staring at it like it might reveal some secret. They thought I was too old, too simple, too set in my ways to understand modern technology. They'd given me a toy to keep me occupied, the way you might give a child a coloring book to keep them quiet during a long car ride. What they didn't know was that I'd been watching Tyler and Emma use their devices for months. I'd seen how their fingers moved across screens, how they navigated between apps, how they seemed to find anything they wanted with just a few taps. I'd been curious about it all, but no one had ever thought to ask if I wanted to learn. They'd simply assumed I couldn't. I picked up the phone and pressed the power button. The screen lit up and a voice in my head, my own voice, said something that surprised me. "Let's see what you're really capable of." The next few weeks became a secret education. Every morning, after Michael left for work and Ashley dropped the kids at school, I would sit with that phone and explore. I started with the basics, figuring out how to adjust the volume, how to change the brightness, how to connect to the Wi-Fi network. I downloaded apps, deleted them, downloaded different ones. I watched YouTube videos about how to use smartphones, taking notes in a small notebook I kept hidden in my jewelry box. I learned about Google, about how I could ask it questions and get answers instantly. I discovered social media, online shopping, news websites, weather apps, maps that could show me exactly where I was and how to get anywhere I wanted to go. Most importantly, I learned that the phone could be a window to information I'd never had access to before. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 3 years, I'd felt disconnected from the world, isolated in my converted garage, reduced to someone who asked permission to use the good bathroom or to take food from the refrigerator. But now, with this device they'd given me to keep me quiet, I was more connected than I'd ever been. I started small. I looked up recipes online, finding new ways to cook the affordable ingredients I could buy with my limited budget. I read news articles, caught up on current events, learned about things happening in the world beyond Leopard Street. I even started reading books again, downloading library apps that let me borrow novels without having to ask Michael for rides to the branch downtown. But the real breakthrough came when I stumbled across something that changed everything: tenant rights websites. It started innocently enough. The air conditioning in my unit had been broken for 2 weeks, and despite my mentions of it to Michael, nothing had been done. Ashley kept saying they were looking into it, but the Texas heat was becoming unbearable. I was sleeping with wet towels on my forehead and spending my afternoons at the public library just to stay cool. One evening, while lying on my couch with a fan pointed directly at my face, I picked up the phone and typed, "Landlord won't fix air conditioning Texas," into Google. What I found made my blood run cold and my spine straighten for the first time in months. Page after page of information about tenant rights, about what landlords were legally required to provide, about how long they had to respond to repair requests, about what tenants could do when those requirements weren't met. I read about habitability standards, about the right to a living space that met basic health and safety requirements, about legal remedies for tenants whose rights were being violated. And then I found something that made my heart race: our landlord's contact information. Michael had always handled all communication with Robert Chen, the man who owned our duplex. I'd never spoken to him directly, never even seen him except for the day we signed the lease 3 years ago. Michael insisted that it was easier if everything went through him, that Mr. Chen preferred to deal with the primary leaseholder, that I didn't need to worry about business stuff. But there it was, right on the Coastal Properties LLC website. Robert Chen's direct phone number, his email address, even his office hours. I stared at that information for a long time, my thumb hovering over the numbers. I thought about 3 years of being told not to worry about things, not to get involved, not to make waves. I thought about broken air conditioning and leaky faucets and a dozen other small problems that had been dismissed or delayed. I thought about sitting in a sweltering apartment while my family enjoyed central air in the main house, waiting for someone else to decide that my comfort mattered enough to warrant a phone call. Then I thought about all those years in the school cafeteria, dealing with vendors who tried to shortchange us, bureaucrats who wanted to cut nutrition programs, administrators who thought feeding children was less important than saving money. I'd never been quiet then. I'd never waited for someone else to speak up for what was right. I'd forgotten who I used to be, but that phone had reminded me. The next morning, while the house was empty and quiet, I sat at my table with the phone in my hands and dialed Robert Chen's number. My heart pounded as it rang, but my voice was steady when he answered. "Mr. Chen? This is Dorothy Martinez." I'm calling about the air conditioning unit in the back apartment at 1247 Leopard Street. What happened next changed everything. Robert Chen's voice was crisp and professional when he answered, but I could hear a hint of surprise when I introduced myself. There was a pause, and I imagined him checking his records, trying to place my name with the property address. Mrs. Martinez, he said slowly, I believe I usually speak with your son Michael about any issues with the property. Yes, well, Michael is at work, I replied, surprised by how calm I sounded. And I'm the one sitting in 90-degree heat with no air conditioning. Another pause. How long has the unit been out? 16 days, I said, looking at the calendar where I'd been marking X's like a prisoner counting time. I mentioned it to Michael on the 3rd day, and he said he'd contact you. On the 7th day, I mentioned it again. Yesterday was day 15, and when I asked about it, my daughter-in-law told me these things take time. I could hear Robert Chen typing on his computer. I don't show any work orders or service requests for that unit, Mrs. Martinez. Are you certain your son contacted our office? The question hung in the air like smoke. Was I certain? I'd assumed Michael had called. I'd trusted that when he said he'd take care of it, that meant he'd actually done something. But sitting there with the phone pressed to my ear, listening to a landlord tell me no one had reported the problem, I realized I'd been naive. Mr. Chen, I said, my voice gaining strength, what I'm certain of is that I've been living without air conditioning for over 2 weeks in this heat, and regardless of what communication may or may not have happened, I need this fixed today. Absolutely, he said, and I could hear papers rustling. I can have someone out there this afternoon. I apologize for the delay, Mrs. Martinez. In the future, please feel free to call me directly if there are any maintenance issues. All tenants have the right to contact the landlord about habitability concerns. All tenants have the right. The words echoed in my head long after I hung up the phone. I sat there staring at the device in my hands, feeling something shift inside me like tectonic plates realigning. For 3 years, I'd been told what I could and couldn't do, who I could and couldn't contact, what I should and shouldn't worry about. But with one phone call, I'd learned that I had rights I'd never exercised. Power I'd never claimed. The repair technician arrived at 2 o'clock that afternoon, a young man named David who apologized profusely for the delay and had the air conditioning running within an hour. As cool air began flowing through my apartment for the first time in weeks, I felt something I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember. Victory. But the real revelation came that evening, when Michael stormed into my apartment without knocking, his face flushed with anger and embarrassment. Mom, what the hell were you thinking calling Mr. Chen directly? He demanded, pacing around my small living space like a caged animal. I told you I was handling it. Were you? I asked, still feeling the confidence from my afternoon success. Because he said no one had contacted him about the air conditioning. Michael stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression shifting from anger to something that looked uncomfortably like guilt. I was going to call. I've been busy with work and I was sleeping with wet towels on my face for over 2 weeks while you were too busy to make a phone call. I interrupted, my voice sharper than it had been in years. That's not fair, Mom. You know I've got a lot on my plate. Ashley's been working extra shifts, the kids have school stuff, and my job. Your job doesn't prevent you from making a 5-minute phone call about your mother's living conditions, I said, standing up from my chair. In the cool air of my newly functional apartment, I felt steadier, stronger. And more importantly, why didn't you tell me I could call him myself? Why have I been going through you like I'm a child who can't handle her own business? Michael's mouth opened and closed a few times before he found words. I was trying to make things easier for you. You don't need to deal with landlord stuff and repairs and all that hassle. What I don't need, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm, is to live in conditions that would be illegal if this were a rental property instead of family housing. What I don't need is to be treated like I'm incapable of making a phone call or understanding a conversation about air conditioning repair. Mom, you're overreacting. It's fixed now, isn't it? That word, overreacting, hit me like a physical blow. How many times had I heard that over the years? How many legitimate concerns had been dismissed with that phrase? How many times had my feelings been minimized because they were inconvenient for someone else? "Michael," I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more weight than shouting, "I need you to leave my apartment." "What?" "You heard me. This is my space, my home, and I'm asking you to leave." He stared at me like I'd grown a second head. "Mom, I think you're getting worked up over nothing. Why don't we talk about this tomorrow, when you've had a chance to cool down?" There it was again. The dismissal. The assumption that my feelings weren't valid, that my anger wasn't justified, that I needed time to cool down from having perfectly reasonable expectations about basic living conditions. "Michael, get out." After he left, slamming the door behind him, I sat in my blessedly cool apartment and tried to process what had just happened. I'd stood up to my son. I'd asserted my rights. I'd refused to be dismissed. And it felt terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. But the real awakening was yet to come. Over the next few days, I dove deeper into my phone exploration with a new sense of purpose. If I'd been wrong about my tenant rights, what else had I been wrong about? If I'd been kept in the dark about basic property management communications, what other information had been filtered or withheld? I started by researching the duplex itself. Within minutes, I found the property records online, including the monthly rent amount that Michael paid to Robert Chen. The number made me sit back in my chair so hard I nearly tipped it over. Michael had told me the rent was $1,800 a month, and I'd been contributing $600 of my Social Security to help with expenses. But according to the county records, the actual rent was $1,400 a month. For 3 years, I'd been paying nearly half the rent while being told I was just helping out with a much larger expense. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was what I found when I searched deeper into the property management company's website. Coastal Properties LLC didn't just manage rental units. They also handled rent-to-own agreements and lease purchase contracts. And there, buried in the terms and conditions section, I found something that made my blood boil. Our duplex was on a lease-to-own contract. Michael wasn't just renting the property, he was buying it, with a portion of each monthly payment going toward ownership equity. My $600 contribution wasn't just helping with rent. It was helping him buy a house he'd never told me he was purchasing. I sat staring at that information for hours, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. For 3 years, I'd been paying for a house that Michael was buying, living in a converted garage while contributing to his equity, believing I was a burden being graciously housed rather than a financial contributor being systematically deceived. The next morning, I called Robert Chen again. "Mrs. Martinez," he said, his voice warm with recognition. "I hope the air conditioning is working well for you." "It is, thank you. Mr. Chen, I have a question about our lease agreement. I'm wondering if you could clarify the terms of the rent-to-own contract." There was a long pause. "Mrs. Martinez, are you asking as a tenant or as a party to the lease?" "I'm asking as someone who's been contributing to the monthly payments for 3 years and would like to understand what I'm paying for." Another pause, longer this time. "Ma'am, I'm not sure I should be discussing the contract details with you without your son present. The lease is in his name, and typically we only share that information with the primary leaseholder." "Mr. Chen," I said, my voice taking on the tone I'd once used with difficult food service vendors, "I'm 68 years old, not 6. I'm capable of understanding a real estate contract. I'm also the person who's been making a significant portion of the payments on this property for 3 years. Now, am I or am I not entitled to understand what my money is purchasing?" "Well," he said slowly, "if you're a contributing party to the payments, you do have certain rights to information about the agreement." "Are you saying your son hasn't shared the contract terms with you?" "I'm saying I was told this was rental assistance, not a home purchase. And I'm saying I'd like to see the paperwork." "Mrs. Martinez, I can email you a copy of the contract this afternoon, but I have to tell you, if there's been some miscommunication about the nature of the agreement, that's something you'll need to work out with your son. From a legal standpoint, the contract is valid and current." After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hands, trembling slightly from adrenaline and anger. Within an hour, my email inbox chimed with a message from Robert Chen containing a PDF of the lease-to-own agreement. Reading that contract was like discovering a secret life my family had been living without me. The monthly payment included $1,200 in rent and $200 in equity contribution. At the end of the 7-year term, Michael would own the property outright. My $600 monthly contribution was covering half the total payment, which meant I was funding half of his path to homeownership while being housed in what was essentially a storage shed. But the most devastating part was buried in the fine print. The contract included a clause about additional occupants and their rights. Any person contributing more than 30% of the monthly payment for more than 12 consecutive months was entitled to be added to the ownership agreement as a co-purchaser. My $600 contribution over 3 years made me eligible for partial ownership of the property I was living in. Michael had never mentioned this clause. Ashley had never hinted at it. For 3 years, they'd accepted my money while treating me like a charity case, never telling me that I had a legal right to equity in the home I was helping to buy. I spent the rest of that day researching tenant rights, co-ownership laws, and elder financial abuse statutes. What I learned made me realize that my situation was more complicated than I'd understood. While Michael hadn't technically stolen my money, he'd withheld crucial information about my rights and my contributions. In some jurisdictions, that could constitute financial exploitation of an elderly person. But more than the legal implications, I was grappling with the emotional betrayal. My own son had watched me scrimp and save to contribute my $600 each month, had listened to me apologize for being a burden, had seen me minimize my needs and wants because I felt guilty about taking up space in his home, all while knowing that my money was helping him build wealth I'd never benefit from. That evening, Ashley knocked on my door with a casserole dish and her usual bright smile. "I made extra chicken and rice," she said, stepping into my apartment without waiting for an invitation. "Thought you might be hungry." I looked at her standing in my doorway, holding food like an offering, and felt something cold settle in my chest. This was the same woman who'd suggested I stay in my apartment during the work barbecue, who'd made comments about grocery expenses when I ate with the family, who'd repeatedly emphasized my privacy and independence while taking hundreds of dollars from me each month. "Ashley," I said, not accepting the dish, "we need to talk." "Oh," she said, her smile flickering slightly. "Is everything okay? I know about the lease-to-own agreement." The casserole dish slipped in her hands, and she nearly dropped it before catching it against her chest. Her face went through several expressions: surprise, guilt, calculation, before settling on defensive innocence. "I'm not sure what you mean, Dot. I mean, I know that the monthly payment isn't $1,800 in rent. I know it's $1,400 total, with $200 going toward ownership equity. I know that my $600 contribution is helping Michael buy this house, not just covering rental expenses." Ashley's mouth opened and closed several times. "Well, I mean, yes, technically there's some ownership component, but it's really complicated, and we didn't want to burden you with all the financial details." "Burden me?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Ashley, I've been managing money longer than you've been alive. I balanced budgets for a school district for over 3 decades. I think I can handle understanding a real estate contract." "It's not that we don't think you can understand it," she said quickly. "It's just that Michael handles all our financial stuff, and we thought it would be simpler." "Simpler for who? Simpler for you to take my money without explaining what I was paying for? Simpler to let me feel guilty about being a burden while I was actually helping you build equity in property I'll never own?" Ashley set the casserole dish on my table and wrapped her arms around herself like she was cold. "Dot, I think you're misunderstanding the situation. We've been taking care of you, providing you with housing and utilities, and I've been paying for it," I interrupted. "More than paying for it. According to the contract terms, my contribution level over the past 3 years qualifies me for co-ownership rights that you never mentioned." The color drained from Ashley's face. "Co-ownership rights? Did you think I wouldn't find out? Did you think I'd just keep handing over my Social Security checks forever without asking questions?" "We never meant for you to feel deceived," Ashley said, her voice small. "We just thought it would be easier if you made the decisions and I just went along with them. If you kept me in the dark about my own financial situation, if you treated me like a confused old woman who couldn't handle her own business." Ashley stared at me for a long moment, and I could see her struggling to find words that would smooth over what couldn't be smoothed. Finally, she said, "Maybe we should wait for Michael to get home and discuss this as a family." "No," I said firmly. I'm done waiting for Michael to handle my affairs. I'm done being discussed like I'm not in the room. This is my money, my living situation, and my decision to make. Your decision about what? I looked around my small apartment, at the fold-out couch and the mismatched furniture, and the single window that faced the alley behind the house. For 3 years, this had been my world, my carefully circumscribed existence. I'd made it work because I'd believed I had no choice, because I'd been told this was the best arrangement for everyone, because I'd accepted that my needs were secondary to family harmony. But standing there with my phone in my pocket, surrounded by the information I'd gathered about my rights and my options, I realized that I did have choices. I'd always had choices. I'd just been convinced to ignore them. I need to think about what comes next, I told Ashley. And I need to do that thinking without input from people who've been making decisions about my life without consulting me. After Ashley left, I sat in my cool apartment with the casserole she'd brought growing cold on my table. I picked up my phone and started researching senior housing options in Corpus Christi, apartment rental prices, and Social Security benefit calculations. For the first time in 3 years, I wasn't asking anyone's permission or waiting for someone else's approval. I was making my own plans. The phone had given me more than access to information. It had given me back my voice, my agency, my right to make decisions about my own life. And now that I'd remembered what that felt like, I wasn't sure I could ever go back to being the quiet, grateful grandmother who asked for nothing and expected less. The awakening was complete. Now came the hard part, deciding what to do with my newfound power. The decision came to me at 4:17 in the morning on a Thursday. Not in a moment of anger or desperation, but in the quiet certainty that sometimes arrives when you finally stopped fighting against what you know to be true. I was lying on my fold-out couch, listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling and the distant hum of traffic on Ocean Drive, when I realized I wasn't going to spend another day asking permission to live my own life. I reached for my phone in the darkness and opened the Notes app I'd discovered the week before. By the pale glow of the screen, I began typing a list, my thumbs moving slowly but deliberately across the keyboard. Find apartment. Check bank account. Calculate monthly income. Call lawyer about co-ownership rights. Research senior communities. Pack important papers. Each item on the list felt like a small act of rebellion, a declaration that I was no longer content to let other people manage my existence. For 3 years, I'd lived in reaction to other people's decisions, adapting to spaces and schedules and financial arrangements that were presented to me as fixed realities. But sitting there in the pre-dawn darkness, I understood that nothing was actually fixed. Everything could be changed if I was willing to do the changing. The first call I made that morning was to Coastal Bank, where I'd had my checking account for over 20 years. I'd been so disconnected from my own finances that I hadn't checked my balance in months, simply trusting that my Social Security deposits were going in, and my automatic payment to Michael was going out. But when the automated system read my current balance back to me, I nearly dropped the phone. I had $18,347 in my checking account. For a moment, I thought there must be some mistake. I called back, went through the menu again, listened to the number repeated. Then I used my phone to log into online banking for the first time, following a YouTube tutorial that walked me through each step. There it was on the screen. Months and months of deposits, with only my $600 payment to Michael going out each month. I'd been living so carefully, spending so little on myself, that I'd accidentally saved more money than I'd had in years. But the real shock came when I clicked on my Social Security account. My monthly benefit was $1,843, significantly more than I'd remembered. Somehow, in the transition to living with Michael, I'd lost track of the exact amount. I'd been giving him a third of my income, while living like someone with barely enough to survive. The financial discovery gave me courage for the next call, to a legal aid society I'd found online that offered free consultations for seniors. The lawyer I spoke with, a patient woman named Maria Santos, listened to my situation and asked questions that made me realize how much I didn't know about my own rights. "Mrs. Martinez," she said after I'd explained the housing arrangement and my financial contributions, "you mentioned that you've been paying $600 monthly for 3 years on a property with a lease-to-own agreement. Have you received any documentation showing your equity stake in the property?" "I didn't know I was supposed to receive documentation," I admitted. "Well, based on what you've told me, Your contribution level and duration would typically entitle you to some form of ownership interest, especially if the contract has a clause about additional contributors. But more importantly, the fact that you weren't informed about the nature of the agreement or your potential rights could constitute a form of financial exploitation. Financial exploitation. The phrase hung in the air like smoke. What does that mean exactly? It means that when someone in a position of trust, like a family member, withholds important financial information or misrepresents the nature of financial arrangements to their advantage, it can be considered a form of elder abuse. Now, I'm not saying that's definitely what happened here, but I think you should have a lawyer review your situation and help you understand your options. After that call, I sat in my apartment for a long time, staring at the walls that had felt like protection but now seemed more like barriers. I thought about trust and family, and the difference between being taken care of and being taken advantage of. I thought about the woman I'd been before Carlos died, before I'd moved into this converted garage, before I'd started apologizing for taking up space in the world. That afternoon, I did something I hadn't done in 3 years. I went for a drive. I'd kept my car when I moved in with Michael, a 2015 Honda Civic that had served me well through my final years of work. But I'd driven it so rarely since moving to Leopard Street that I'd almost forgotten the freedom of being able to go wherever I wanted without asking anyone's permission or explaining my destination. I turned the key in the ignition, and when the engine started on the first try, I felt something lift in my chest. I drove east toward the bay, past the industrial port with its massive cranes and shipping containers, past the seafood restaurants and bait shops, until I reached the water. I parked at Cole Park and walked to a bench overlooking the bay, breathing in the salt air that I'd forgotten lived just 15 minutes from where I'd been hiding. The water was choppy that day, green-gray under an overcast sky, and pelicans dive-bombed for fish, while seagulls wheeled overhead. I sat there for over an hour, watching boats navigate the channel and remembering what it felt like to exist in a space without walls, without rules about where I could go and when I needed to be back. When I returned to the duplex, Michael's truck was in the driveway. I found him in my apartment, standing in the middle of my living room with his hands on his hips, and an expression I hadn't seen since he was a teenager caught breaking curfew. "Where were you?" he demanded before I'd even closed the door behind me. "I went for a drive," I said, hanging my keys on the hook by the door with deliberate calm. "Ashley said you seemed upset when she came by yesterday, and then you weren't here when she stopped by this afternoon to check on you. We were worried. Worried or annoyed that I wasn't where you expected me to be?" Michael's face flushed. "Mom, that's not fair. We care about you, and when you disappear without telling anyone where you're going—" "Michael," I interrupted, "I'm 68 years old, not 8. I don't need to check in with anyone before I leave my own home." "This isn't about age, Mom. It's about consideration. We're a family, and families communicate with each other." I looked at my son, this man I'd raised who was now standing in my space explaining to me how families should work, and felt something snap inside me like a taut wire finally giving way. "You want to talk about family communication, Michael? Let's talk about how you've been letting me pay for half of a house you're buying without telling me I was building equity. Let's talk about how you've been accepting $600 a month from me while telling me the rent was $1,800 when it's actually $1,400. Let's talk about how you've kept me in the dark about financial arrangements that directly affect my future while making me feel grateful for the privilege of living in your converted garage." Michael's mouth opened and closed several times before he found words. "Mom, I can explain all of that. The financial stuff is complicated, and we didn't want to stress you out with details." "Details?" I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Details like the fact that I have legal rights to co-ownership of this property? Details like the fact that my contribution level qualifies me for equity stakes that you never mentioned? Details like the fact that keeping me uninformed about my own financial situation could constitute elder financial abuse?" The color drained from Michael's face. "Elder abuse? Mom, that's ridiculous. We've been taking care of you, providing you with housing, and you've been taking care of yourselves with my money while convincing me I should be grateful for the arrangement," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. "Do you have any idea what it's been like to live for 3 years feeling like a burden, like someone who takes up too much space, like someone whose needs are always secondary to everyone else's convenience? We never meant for you to feel that way. But you never asked how I did feel, did you? You never checked to see if I was happy or comfortable or satisfied with the living arrangement. You just assumed that because I wasn't complaining, everything was fine. Michael sat down heavily on one of my mismatched chairs, suddenly looking older than his 42 years. Mom, I'm sorry if we handled things wrong. But you have to understand, after Dad died, you seemed so lost, so unable to cope with things. We were trying to help. I was grieving, Michael. That's not the same as being incompetent. And even if I had been struggling to manage things on my own, that didn't give you the right to make decisions about my life without consulting me. So what do you want to do now? He asked, his voice small. Do you want us to add you to the ownership papers? Do you want a different financial arrangement? I looked around my small apartment, at the fold-out couch and the kitchenette, and the single window that faced the alley. 3 years ago, this space had seemed like a reasonable compromise, a way to maintain some independence while having family nearby. But now it felt like what it had always been, a place where someone else had decided I belonged, whether I wanted to be there or not. I want to move out, I said. The words surprised me as much as they surprised Michael. I hadn't planned to say them, hadn't consciously made that decision. But as soon as they were spoken, I knew they were true. Move out? Michael repeated. Mom, that's crazy. Where would you go? How would you afford rent on your own? What about your health, your safety? My health is fine, Michael. My safety was never in question. And as for affording rent, I've been paying $600 a month here, and according to the apartment listings I've been looking at, I can get a decent one-bedroom place for $900 to $1,100 a month. With my Social Security income, that's completely manageable. You've been looking at apartment listings? I've been doing a lot of research lately, I said, pulling out my phone and showing him the screen. Did you know there are websites where you can search for apartments by price range and amenities? Did you know there are senior communities with activities and social programs? Did you know there are shuttle services for elderly residents who don't drive? There's a whole world of options that no one ever told me about. Michael stared at the phone like it was an alien artifact. Mom, you can't just make major life decisions based on stuff you read online. You need to think this through, maybe talk to a professional about your options. I have talked to a professional. I spoke with a lawyer today about my rights regarding this property and my financial situation. I also spoke with several apartment complexes about availability and pricing. I've done more research about my living situation in the past week than anyone has done for me in the past 3 years. A lawyer? Michael's voice cracked slightly. Mom, why would you need a lawyer? Because I wanted to understand my rights, something that should have been explained to me from the beginning. Because I wanted to know what options I have for recovering the equity I've built in this property. Because I wanted to make sure that if I decide to leave, I'm not giving up anything I'm legally entitled to. Michael stood up and began pacing around my small living room, running his hands through his hair. This is insane. You can't just uproot your whole life because you're mad about some miscommunication about the lease agreement. This isn't about anger, Michael. This is about autonomy. This is about living my life according to my own choices instead of adapting to everyone else's decisions. This is about remembering that I'm a capable adult who can manage her own affairs. But Mom, you're 68 years old. What if something happens to you? What if you have a medical emergency? What if you can't take care of yourself? Then I'll deal with those situations when they arise, just like every other adult in the world. Michael, I managed a school cafeteria for 32 years. I raised 2 children, buried 1 husband, and survived 68 years on this planet. I think I can handle living in my own apartment. What about the kids? What about Tyler and Emma? They'll miss you. It was a low blow, and we both knew it. I thought about my grandchildren, about the hugs that had become less frequent, and the conversations that had dwindled to requests for snacks and help with homework. I thought about how they'd grown accustomed to treating me like furniture, present but not particularly important. The kids will be fine, I said quietly. And maybe, when I'm not available to watch them every afternoon, they'll appreciate the time we do spend together more. So that's it? You're just gonna abandon your family because we didn't explain some paperwork clearly enough? I'm not abandoning anyone, Michael. I'm choosing to live independently instead of as a dependent. There's a difference. When? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm going to look at apartments this weekend. If I find something suitable, I'd like to move out within the month. Michael stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him struggling to process this version of his mother, this woman who made unilateral decisions and researched legal rights and refused to be managed like a child. I need to talk to Ashley about this, he finally said. You can talk to Ashley about whatever you like, I replied, but this decision is mine to make, and it's already made. After Michael left, I sat in my apartment feeling shaky and exhilarated, like I'd just jumped off a cliff and discovered I could fly. The conversation had been harder than I'd expected, but also more liberating. For the first time in 3 years, I'd spoken up for what I wanted, instead of just accepting what was offered. That evening, I called my sister Carmen in San Antonio, someone I'd barely spoken to since moving in with Michael, because phone calls felt like luxuries I couldn't afford in my carefully circumscribed life. Dottie? Carmen's voice was warm with surprise. My God, it's been months. How are you, honey? I'm good, Carmen. Actually, I'm better than good. I'm making some changes in my life. I told her about the phone, about the research I'd been doing, about the discoveries I'd made about my financial situation. I told her about my decision to move out on my own, and I waited for her to express concern or try to talk me out of it. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment before saying, It's about damn time. What? Dottie, I've been worried about you for 3 years, but every time I called, you sounded so diminished, like you'd gotten smaller somehow. I kept wanting to ask if you were really happy there, but you always insisted everything was fine. I thought everything was fine. I thought I was being reasonable, practical. Honey, there's nothing practical about shrinking yourself to fit into someone else's idea of what your life should look like. You've been living like a guest in your own family. Carmen's words hit me like a physical blow, partly because they were true, and partly because I'd been so isolated that I'd forgotten how it felt to have someone understand my experience without explanation. I'm scared, Carmen, I admitted. I haven't lived alone in over 40 years. What if I can't manage it? What if something goes wrong? Then you'll figure it out, just like you've figured out everything else in your life. Dottie, you managed a school kitchen that fed 500 kids a day. You balanced budgets and dealt with vendors and handled staff schedules. You think you can't manage your own grocery shopping and bill paying? When you put it like that, it does sound kind of ridiculous. It doesn't sound ridiculous, honey. It sounds like someone convinced you that you were less capable than you actually are, and now you're remembering who you really are. After we hung up, I sat with my phone in my hands, scrolling through apartment listings with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I bookmarked several properties to visit, made notes about questions to ask, even started a list of furniture I'd need to buy. For the first time since Carlos died, I was planning a future instead of just surviving the present. The phone that Michael and Ashley had given me to keep me quiet had become the tool that gave me back my voice. And now that I'd remembered how to use that voice, I was ready to start speaking up for the life I actually wanted to live. The leap wasn't just about moving out of Michael's duplex. It was about reclaiming my right to make decisions about my own existence, to choose spaces and routines and relationships that served my needs, instead of simply accommodating everyone else's. It was about remembering that being a mother and grandmother didn't mean erasing myself to make room for everyone else. The apartment search began the next morning, and with each property I visited, I felt myself expanding back into the woman I'd been before I'd learned to apologize for taking up space in the world. The first apartment I looked at was a disaster. The carpet was stained, the kitchen faucet dripped incessantly, and the landlord, a sweaty man in his 50s who kept calling me sweetie, spent the entire tour explaining why the rent might be too expensive for someone on a fixed income. I left feeling discouraged until I realized that his condescension had actually clarified something important for me. I didn't have to settle for spaces or people that made me feel small. The second apartment was better but wrong, in ways I couldn't articulate. The third was too far from the grocery store. The fourth had neighbors who seemed to view any sound above a whisper as a personal assault. But the fifth apartment, a one-bedroom unit in a complex called Bayview Gardens, felt different the moment I walked through the door. The apartment was on the second floor of a well-maintained building about 10 minutes from downtown Corpus Christi. The living room had large windows that faced east, letting in the kind of morning light I'd missed for 3 years. The kitchen was small but functional, with enough counter space for actual cooking and a breakfast nook that overlooked a courtyard filled with live oak trees. The bedroom was larger than my entire living space at Michael's, with a walk-in closet and an ensuite bathroom that included a bathtub deep enough for a real soak. But what sold me on the place wasn't the physical space, though that was lovely. It was the property manager, a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who treated me like a competent adult from the moment we met. "Mrs. Martinez," she said, shaking my hand firmly, "I see from your application that you're recently widowed and looking to downsize. This is a popular choice for people in similar situations. The complex has a good mix of residents, from young professionals to retirees, and we've found that creates a nice community atmosphere." She didn't ask if I was sure I could afford the rent, or suggest that I might need someone to co-sign the lease. She didn't speak slowly or repeat herself, or use diminutive terms like sweetie or dear. She simply showed me the apartment, answered my questions about utilities and lease terms, and handed me the application paperwork with the confidence that I was capable of reading and understanding it myself. "The rent is $1,050 per month," she said, "which includes water and trash pickup. You'll be responsible for electricity and cable or internet if you want those services. We require first month's rent and a security deposit equal to 1 month's rent to move in. Do you have any questions about the lease terms?" I did have questions, lots of them, but they were practical questions about parking assignments and laundry facilities and pet policies, not defensive questions about whether I was financially or mentally capable of independent living. Rosa answered each one thoroughly and professionally, and by the end of the tour, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: respected. "I'd like to fill out the application," I said, and Rosa smiled like this was the most natural thing in the world. "Wonderful. I can run your credit check and verify your income as soon as you get the paperwork back to me. If everything looks good, you could move in as early as next week." Next week, the timeline felt both impossibly fast and surprisingly manageable. I'd been living in limbo for 3 years, waiting for other people to make decisions about my life, and now I was potentially a week away from having my own space again. I filled out the application that evening, sitting at my small table with my phone beside me so I could look up anything I wasn't sure about. The process was straightforward: personal information, rental history, employment history, income verification, references. I used Robert Chen as my landlord reference, figuring that our recent interactions had established a professional relationship. For personal references, I listed Carmen and my former principal from Flower Bluff Elementary, hoping that 32 years of reliable employment would speak for itself. The hardest part was the section asking about emergency contacts. I stared at that blank line for a long time, pen hovering over the paper. The obvious answer was Michael, but listing him felt like admitting I still needed managing. Eventually, I wrote down Carmen's information and left it at that. Rosa called me the next afternoon to let me know that my application had been approved. My credit score, which I'd been worried about since I hadn't used credit cards in years, was actually excellent. My income was more than sufficient for the rent, and my references had all responded positively. I could move in the following Saturday if I wanted to. "I'll take it," I said, and felt something unlock in my chest when I said the words out loud. "Excellent. I'll email you the lease agreement to review, and you can come by the office Friday to sign and get your keys. Welcome to Bayview Gardens, Mrs. Martinez." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment looking around at the space I'd called home for 3 years. The fold-out couch, the mismatched furniture, the single window that faced the alley. It had never felt like home, I realized. It had felt like a waiting room, a place where I'd been parked while other people decided what to do with me. But I also felt a flutter of anxiety alongside the excitement. It had been so long since I'd lived alone, since I'd been responsible for my own meals and schedules and decisions without input or oversight from anyone else. What if I'd forgotten how to be independent? What if 3 years of being managed had actually made me less capable of self-management? I picked up my phone and opened a notes app, starting a list of everything I'd need to do to make the move happen. Find a moving company or rent a truck. Transfer utilities. Buy furniture. Set up internet service. Open a new bank account at a branch closer to the apartment. Schedule mail forwarding. The list grew longer as I thought about it, but instead of feeling overwhelming, each item felt like a small victory, a task I was capable of completing without asking anyone's permission. The next morning, I drove to the apartment complex to sign the lease and get my keys. The drive took me through parts of Corpus Christi I hadn't seen in years, past the university campus and the downtown marina, through neighborhoods where people were walking dogs and jogging and living their lives in the open air. I'd forgotten how much of the city I'd missed while hiding in my converted garage. Rosa met me in the leasing office with a smile and a folder full of paperwork. "Ready to make it official?" she asked. The lease agreement was 4 pages long, and I read every word of it carefully. The terms were clear and fair, the rent was exactly what she'd quoted, and there were no surprises or hidden fees. When I signed my name on the signature line, I felt like I was signing more than a rental agreement. I was signing a declaration of independence. "Here are your keys," Rosa said, handing me a small ring with 2 keys and a plastic fob for the building's front door. "The mailboxes are in the lobby, and your box number is 247. The laundry room is on the 1st floor, and there's a small fitness center and community room if you're interested in those amenities. Do you have any questions before you get started?" I shook my head, clutching the keys in my palm like talismans. "Thank you, Rosa, for everything." "My pleasure, Mrs. Martinez. I have a feeling you're going to love it here." I drove back to Michael's house with my keys in my purse and my phone full of notes about moving, logistics. But when I pulled into the driveway, I saw Michael's truck and Ashley's car both parked there in the middle of a weekday afternoon. My stomach clenched with the familiar anxiety of being in trouble for something I couldn't name. I found them both in my apartment, sitting on my couch with serious expressions and a manila folder on the coffee table between them. "Mom," Michael said, standing up when I entered, "we need to talk." "About what?" I asked, though I already knew. "About this apartment situation," Ashley said, her voice taking on the gentle tone she used when she was trying to manage difficult situations. "Michael told me about your conversation yesterday, and we're both concerned that you might be making a hasty decision." "I'm not making a hasty decision," I replied, hanging my purse on the door hook. "I'm making a decision I should have made 3 years ago." "Mom, sit down," Michael said, gesturing to the chair across from them. "We've been doing some research, and we think there might be better options for you than trying to live completely independently." I remained standing. "What kind of research?" Ashley opened the manila folder and pulled out several brochures. "We've looked into some really nice senior living communities in the area. Places where you'd have your own apartment but also access to meal services, transportation, social activities, and on-site medical care if you need it." I glanced at the brochures without taking them. The cover photos showed smiling elderly people engaged in activities like water aerobics and card games, with taglines like "active adult living" and "peace of mind for families." "These places look very expensive," I said. "They are," Michael admitted. "But Mom, we've been thinking about your situation and we realize we haven't been handling things fairly. We want to make that right." "How?" Ashley leaned forward, her expression earnest. "We want to buy out your equity stake in this property. Based on what you've contributed over the past 3 years, and considering the appreciation in property value, we think a fair settlement would be around $25,000. That money, combined with your Social Security, would cover the costs of a nice senior community for several years. $25,000. The number hung in the air between us like a peace offering and a bribe rolled into one. It was more money than I'd expected, more than I'd thought my contributions were worth. But it was also a way of making my living situation someone else's problem again, of placing me in an environment where my care and feeding would be managed by professionals instead of family. "And what if I don't want to live in a senior community?" I asked. Michael and Ashley exchanged glances. "Mom," Michael said carefully, "we love you, and we want what's best for you. But we're also worried about your safety and well-being. What if you fall in your apartment, and no one finds you for days? What if you have a medical emergency? What if you get confused about medications or forget to pay bills? What if I'm perfectly capable of managing my own life and you're projecting your anxieties onto me?" "That's not fair," Ashley said. "We're trying to be realistic about the challenges of aging. I'm 68, not 98. I'm not showing signs of dementia or physical incapacity. I'm not confused about medications or forgetful about responsibilities. I'm actually more mentally sharp now than I've been in years, partly because I've started using my brain for something other than anticipating other people's needs. Mom, Michael said, his voice taking on the patient tone he used when he thought I was being unreasonable. You have to admit that 3 years ago, after Dad died, you were pretty lost. You couldn't handle the house, you were forgetting to eat, you seemed overwhelmed by basic tasks. I was grieving, Michael. I was processing the loss of my husband of 43 years, while simultaneously trying to figure out how to reorganize my entire life. That's not the same thing as being incompetent. But you seem so much more, assertive now. It's like you've become a different person in the past few weeks. I haven't become a different person. I've remembered who I was before I started apologizing for existing. Ashley picked up one of the brochures and held it out to me. Just look at this place, Dot. Sunset Manor has beautiful apartments, 3 meals a day, housekeeping services, and a full activities calendar. You could make friends, join clubs, take classes. Wouldn't that be better than sitting alone in some apartment all day? I looked at the brochure, at the photos of people my age looking busy and happy and supervised. Ashley, what makes you think I'd be sitting alone all day? What makes you think I'm incapable of making friends or finding activities or creating a social life for myself? It's not that we think you're incapable, Michael said quickly. It's just that it's hard to start over at 68. Wouldn't it be easier to be in a place where the social connections are built in? Easier for whom? For me or for you? What do you mean? I mean that senior communities solve a problem for adult children more than they solve a problem for the seniors. They provide peace of mind for families who want to know their elderly relatives are being watched and managed. They don't necessarily provide a better quality of life for the people living there. That's not true, Ashley protested. These places are designed specifically for older adults. They understand your needs better than regular apartment complexes. My needs are pretty simple, Ashley. I need a safe place to live, access to transportation, and the freedom to make my own decisions about how I spend my time. I don't need activities directors or meal planners or housekeepers. I especially don't need to live in a place where being 68 is considered a disability that requires professional management. Michael stood up and began pacing around my small living room, a habit he'd developed as a child when he was frustrated. Mom, I don't understand why you're being so stubborn about this. We're trying to help you, and you're acting like we're your enemies. You're not my enemies, Michael, but you're also not my parents. I don't need you to make decisions about where I should live or how I should spend my money or what kind of social life I should have. So you're just going to move into some random apartment and figure it out as you go? That's exactly what I'm going to do. And if it doesn't work out, I'll figure out something else. That's what adults do, Michael. They make decisions, see how those decisions work out, and adjust as needed. Ashley leaned back on the couch, looking defeated. We're just worried about you, Dot. We love you, and we want to make sure you're taken care of. I appreciate that, Ashley, but I'm not a problem that needs to be solved. I'm a person who needs to be respected. So you won't even consider the senior community option? I already have an apartment. I signed the lease this morning. The silence that followed was thick with shock and hurt feelings. Michael stopped pacing and stared at me like I'd announced I was joining the circus. You signed a lease? Without discussing it with us? I discussed it with the person whose opinion matters most. Me. Mom, this is insane. You can't just make major life decisions without consulting your family. Actually, I can. I'm an adult with full legal capacity to make my own housing decisions. I don't need anyone's permission or approval. But what about the equity buyout? What about the $25,000? I looked at the brochures scattered on my coffee table, at the photos of managed happiness and supervised independence. I'll still want to settle the equity situation, but I don't need the money to pay for institutional care. I needed to furnish my own apartment and establish my independence. When? Ashley asked quietly. I move in Saturday. This Saturday? That's 4 days away. I know. I've got a lot to do. Michael sat back down heavily, looking like he'd aged 10 years in the past 10 minutes. Mom, I feel like I don't even know you anymore. That's because you've been living with a version of me that was trying to be what you needed instead of who I actually am. Now you're meeting the real me, and I understand that's unsettling. What can we do to help with the move? Ashley asked, and I was surprised by the genuine concern in her voice. I've got it handled. But thank you for asking. Mom, Michael said, I want you to know that even though I don't understand this decision, I'll support it. If this is what you really want, I'll help however I can. Thank you, Michael. That means a lot. After they left, I sat in my apartment with the senior community brochures still scattered on my table. I picked up one and flipped through it, reading about activities like bingo and craft classes and group outings to the mall. The facilities were beautiful, the apartments were spacious, and the residents looked content. But looking at those photos, I felt claustrophobic. I opened my phone and started researching the places Ashley had suggested. The reviews were mostly positive, but I noticed a pattern in the comments. Residents praised the safety and convenience, but family members were the ones who seemed most enthusiastic about the peace of mind and professional care. The seniors themselves often mentioned missing their independence, their ability to come and go as they pleased, their freedom to make their own schedules. One review in particular stuck with me. It's a lovely place, and everyone is very nice. I'm sure my daughter sleeps better at night knowing I'm here. But I miss cooking my own meals and deciding when to go to bed. I miss having a reason to go to the grocery store or the post office. I feel safe, but I also feel like I'm waiting to die. I closed the browser and picked up my keys to the new apartment. In 4 days, I'd be living in my own space again, making my own decisions about what to eat and when to sleep, and how to spend my time. I'd be responsible for my own mistakes and my own successes. I'd be accountable to myself instead of to a system designed to keep me safe and manageable. The discovery wasn't just about finding an apartment or asserting my independence. It was about discovering that I still had choices, that I still had agency, that I still had the capacity to create a life that reflected my values and preferences, rather than other people's fears and expectations. On Friday morning, I started packing. I'd accumulated remarkably few possessions during my 3 years in the converted garage. But each item I wrapped in newspaper felt significant. The music box from Carlos, the photographs in mismatched frames, the recipe cards written in my mother's handwriting. These were the things that connected me to who I'd been before I learned to make myself small. I also packed things I'd forgotten I owned. Books I'd loved but hadn't read in years. A set of good dishes I'd been saving for special occasions that never came. A quilt my mother had made that I'd kept folded in a closet because there wasn't space for it in my abbreviated living arrangement. As I packed, I thought about the phone call I'd made to Robert Chen about the air conditioning, the moment when I'd realized I had the power to solve my own problems. That had been the beginning, but this was the continuation, the recognition that I could not only solve problems, but create possibilities. Tyler and Emma knocked on my door Friday evening, standing in the doorway with uncertain expressions. "Grandma Dot," Emma said, "are you really moving away?" "I'm moving to my own apartment, sweetheart. I'm not moving away from you." "But you won't live here anymore," Tyler said, his voice smaller than usual. "No, I won't live here anymore. But I'll still be your grandmother, and I'll still want to spend time with you. Maybe you can come visit me in my new place and help me decorate." "Will you have a swimming pool?" Emma asked. "I will, actually. And a fitness center and a community room where we could play games. Can we come over after school sometimes?" "If your parents say it's okay, I'd love that. But you'll have to call first and ask permission, just like you would if you were visiting any other grown-up." They nodded solemnly, and I realized that this might be the first time they'd been asked to treat me like an independent adult, rather than as an extension of their household. Saturday morning arrived gray and humid, typical Texas weather that made moving day feel like an endurance test. I'd hired a small moving company I'd found online, 2 men with a truck who specialized in apartment moves. They arrived at 8 o'clock and had my belongings loaded within an hour. Michael and Ashley came out to watch the loading process, both of them looking like they were attending a funeral rather than helping with a move. "Are you sure about this, Mom?" Michael asked one last time. "I'm sure," I said, and meant it. The drive to Bayview Gardens took 15 minutes through morning traffic, and I followed the moving truck in my Honda Civic with my purse on the passenger seat and my phone full of notes about utility connections and grocery stores and library branches. When we pulled into the complex, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Rosa met me at the apartment to help with the move-in process, and she treated the whole thing like the celebration it was. "Welcome home, Mrs. Martinez," she said, handing me a small gift bag with a bottle of wine and a plant. "I hope you'll be very happy here." The movers carried my few possessions up to the second floor, and within 2 hours everything I owned was scattered around my new apartment waiting to be arranged. After they left, I stood in the middle of my empty living room, surrounded by boxes and possibilities. I unpacked methodically, starting with the kitchen and working my way through each room. I hung my photographs on the walls, arranged my books on the built-in shelves, and made up my bed with the quilt my mother had sewn. I set up my music box on the dresser and played the tiny dancing ballerina for the first time in months. By evening, the apartment looked like a home. Not a perfect home, not a fully furnished or professionally decorated home, but a space that reflected my choices and preferences. I made myself a simple dinner of scrambled eggs and toast, eating at the small table in the breakfast nook while looking out at the courtyard where live oak trees cast shadows in the fading light. After dinner, I called Carmen to let her know I'd made the move. "How does it feel?" she asked. "Scary," I admitted, "but also right. Like I'm finally living in the right-size life for who I actually am." "I'm proud of you, Dottie. I know it wasn't easy." The hardest part was admitting that I'd been living so small for so long. But now that I'm here, I can't imagine staying in that converted garage another day. What's next? I looked around my new apartment, at the morning light that would stream through the east-facing windows, at the kitchen where I could cook real meals, at the space that was mine to organize and decorate and inhabit according to my own preferences. "I'm going to figure out how to be myself again," I said. "I'm going to remember what I like and what I want and what makes me happy. I'm going to stop apologizing for taking up space in the world." Sounds like a good plan. After we hung up, I sat in my new living room with a cup of tea and my phone in my lap. The device that had started as a tool to keep me occupied had become the instrument of my liberation. Through it, I'd discovered my rights, found my voice, researched my options, and created new possibilities for my life. The discovery wasn't just about finding an apartment or asserting my independence. It was about discovering that I was still capable of growth, still capable of change, still capable of creating a life that reflected my values and preferences, rather than other people's fears and expectations. At 68, I was finally learning who I was when I wasn't busy being who everyone else needed me to be. The phone call came at 7:23 on a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after I'd moved into my apartment. I was sitting at my breakfast table, sipping coffee and reading the news on my tablet, when Michael's name appeared on my phone screen. My first instinct was to ignore it, but something about the early hour made me answer. "Mom," his voice was tight with stress, "we need your help." I set down my coffee cup and waited. In the weeks since I'd moved out, our conversations had been polite but distant, like we were still figuring out how to relate to each other now that I wasn't a daily presence in their lives. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Ashley's been in an accident. She's okay, but she's going to be in the hospital for a few days, and then she'll need to stay home for at least 2 weeks while she recovers. I can't take that much time off work, and we need someone to help with the kids." I felt the familiar pull of family obligation, the automatic response to drop everything and rush to help. But I also felt something new, the right to choose my response instead of simply reacting. "I'm sorry to hear about Ashley's accident," I said. "What kind of help do you need? Could you come stay with us for a couple of weeks? Just until Ashley's back on her feet? The kids need to get to school, and someone needs to be here when they get home, and I don't know how else to manage everything." The old me would have said yes immediately, would have packed a bag and driven over without considering what this meant for my own life. But the new me, the woman who'd learned to ask questions and assert boundaries, found herself saying, "Let me think about it." "Think about it?" Michael's voice cracked with surprise. "Mom, this is an emergency. We really need you." "I understand it's an emergency, Michael, but I also have a life now that I can't just drop without consideration. Give me a few hours to figure out how I can help." After I hung up, I sat in my sunny kitchen looking out at the courtyard where my neighbors were walking their dogs and heading to work. In the 6 weeks since I'd moved out, I'd established routines and connections that had nothing to do with my family's needs. I'd joined a book club that met at the library every Thursday evening. I'd started taking a water aerobics class at the community center 3 mornings a week. I'd begun volunteering at a local food bank, using my cafeteria management skills to help organize distributions. Most importantly, I'd made friends, real friends, not just people who needed things from me. There was Margaret, a retired nurse who lived in the apartment below mine and shared my love of mystery novels. There was Elena, a widow my age, who'd moved to Corpus Christi from Houston to be near the water. There was Frank, a retired teacher who'd started a weekly poker game in the community room and who treated me like an equal player rather than someone who needed to be protected from losing. These connections had grown organically, based on shared interests and mutual respect rather than obligation or convenience. I'd forgotten what it felt like to have relationships that existed for their own sake rather than as extensions of my usefulness to other people. But now Michael needed me, and I had to decide what kind of help I was willing to provide and on what terms. I called the hospital first to check on Ashley. She'd been in a car accident, nothing life-threatening, but she'd broken her leg and had a concussion that would require several days of observation. She was groggy but coherent when I spoke with her. "Dot," she said, her voice weak but apologetic. "I'm so sorry to mess up everyone's schedule like this." "Don't apologize for having an accident, Ashley. That's not something you chose. Michael said he was going to ask you to come help with the kids. I know you probably don't want to, after everything that happened with the move and all." "Ashley, I left because I needed my own space, not because I stopped caring about you and the children. If you need help, I'll figure out a way to provide it." "Really?" "Really, but I'm going to do it differently this time." That afternoon, I drove to Michael's house to assess the situation. Tyler and Emma were at school, and Michael was at the hospital with Ashley, so I let myself in with the key I'd never returned and walked through the house I'd lived in for 3 years. It looked different to me now, smaller somehow, and I realized that wasn't because the house had changed, but because I had. The converted garage where I'd lived looked particularly cramped and depressing, and I couldn't believe I'd spent 3 years sleeping on that fold-out couch and cooking on that tiny hot plate. When Michael came home that evening, he found me in the kitchen making dinner for the kids. "Mom," he said, relief flooding his voice, "thank you for coming. I didn't know what else to do." "We need to talk about the terms," I said, not looking up from the stove where I was stirring spaghetti sauce. "Terms? I'm willing to help with the children while Ashley recovers, but I'm not willing to move back into the garage apartment. I'll drive over here every morning and leave every evening, but I'm going home to my own place every night." Michael looked confused. "That seems like a lot of driving back and forth. Wouldn't it be easier to just stay here?" "Easier for you, maybe, but not for me. I have a life now, Michael. I have commitments and routines and relationships that matter to me. I'm willing to adjust my schedule to help during this crisis, but I'm not willing to put my life on hold." "What kind of commitments?" I told him about the book club, the water aerobics classes, the food bank volunteering, the poker games. I told him about Margaret and Elena and Frank, about the community I'd built in just 6 weeks of independent living. "I didn't know you were doing all that," he said, and I could hear the surprise in his voice. "You didn't ask." When I lived here, nobody asked what I wanted to do with my time or what would make me happy. Everyone just assumed I was available for whatever needed doing. "I guess I thought you were lonely." I was lonely, Michael. But I was lonely because I was isolated from meaningful connections, not because I was living alone. There's a difference between solitude and loneliness. Tyler and Emma arrived home from school while we were talking, and they ran to hug me like I'd been gone for months instead of weeks. "Grandma Dot," Emma squealed, "are you moving back?" "No, sweetheart, I'm here to help take care of you while your mom gets better, but I'm not moving back. I have my own home now." "Can we see it?" Tyler asked. "Can we come visit your apartment?" "Of course you can. Maybe this weekend, if your dad says it's okay." Over the next 2 weeks, I established a routine that worked for everyone. I arrived at Michael's house every morning at 7 to help get the kids ready for school. I picked them up every afternoon and stayed until Michael got home from work. I cooked dinner most nights and helped with homework and bedtime routines. But every evening, I drove back to my own apartment, to my own space, to my own life. The arrangement worked better than I'd expected. The kids adapted quickly to having their grandmother as a temporary caregiver, and Michael seemed to appreciate the consistency and reliability I provided. But most importantly, I discovered that I could be helpful to my family without sacrificing my own identity or independence. On the Thursday of the second week, I had to leave a little early to make it to book club. I'd been looking forward to the discussion all week, and I wasn't willing to miss it even for family obligations. "Where are you going?" Michael asked when I started gathering my things at 5:30. "Book club. I told you about it." "But I won't be home until 6. Can't you skip it this one time?" "No, Michael, I can't. You'll have to figure out how to manage the last 30 minutes on your own." "Mom, that's not fair. I'm already stressed about juggling work and Ashley's care and the kids' schedules." "Then hire a babysitter for the 30 minutes you need coverage. Or ask one of your neighbors to help. Or arrange to leave work 30 minutes earlier. But don't ask me to give up my commitments because you haven't planned adequately for your own needs." Michael stared at me like I'd suggested he juggle flaming torches. "You're really going to leave us hanging for a book club?" "I'm going to honor my commitments the same way I've honored my commitment to help you during this crisis. The difference is that I'm not asking you to choose between your responsibilities and your personal life." I left at 5:30 and drove to the library, where Margaret and Elena and the rest of our group were waiting to discuss the month's selection, a mystery novel about a retired woman who becomes an amateur detective. The irony wasn't lost on me. "How's the caregiving going?" Margaret asked as we settled into our usual circle of chairs. "It's going well, actually, but it's different this time. I'm helping because I choose to, not because I have to. And I'm not letting it become my entire identity." "Good for you," said Elena. "It's easy to fall back into old patterns when family members are in crisis." I almost did. But then I realized that being useful to my family doesn't mean I have to be invisible to myself. When I got home that evening, I found a voicemail from Michael. His voice was tired, but not angry. "Mom, I'm sorry about earlier. You're right that I need to figure out my own scheduling issues instead of expecting you to adjust yours. I appreciate everything you're doing for us, and I don't want to take advantage of your help." It was the first time in years that Michael had apologized to me for anything, and I felt something shift between us. A recognition of mutual respect that hadn't existed when I lived in his converted garage. Ashley came home from the hospital the following Monday, and I continued my daily routine of morning and afternoon coverage while she recovered. But as her mobility improved and she needed less assistance, I gradually reduced my involvement, transitioning from full-time caregiver back to occasional helper. "I don't know how to thank you," Ashley said on my last day of regular coverage. "I know this wasn't easy, especially after everything that happened with the move." "You don't need to thank me, Ashley. This is what family does for each other." "But you didn't have to help. You could have said no." "I could have, but I didn't want to. There's a difference between being obligated to help and choosing to help. I think I understand that now. And I want you to know that I'm sorry about how we handled things before. We should have been more honest with you about the lease agreement and your financial contributions. We should have treated you like a partner instead of a dependent. Thank you for saying that. It means a lot. Would you like to stay for dinner? Michael's bringing home pizza." I looked around the kitchen where I'd spent so many evenings cooking for people who took my presence for granted, and I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and relief. Thanks, but I have plans tonight. Elena and I are going to a movie. That sounds nice. You seem really happy, Dot. Like you're more yourself than you were when you lived here. I am more myself. I'm the person I was before I forgot that I had choices. That evening, I drove back to my apartment for the last time as a daily caregiver. Elena was waiting for me in the lobby, dressed for our movie date and carrying a small bag of popcorn she'd made at home. "How did it go?" she asked as we walked to my car. "It went well. Better than I expected, actually. I was able to help without losing myself in the process." That's a hard balance to strike. It is. But I think the key is remembering that you can't take care of other people properly if you're not taking care of yourself first. Wise words from a wise woman. As we drove toward the movie theater, I thought about the past few weeks and what they'd taught me about family relationships. I'd learned that I could be helpful without being sacrificial, that I could maintain boundaries while still being loving, that I could choose my level of involvement instead of simply accepting whatever was asked of me. Most importantly, I'd learned that my family relationships were healthier when they were based on mutual respect rather than dependency. When I'd lived in Michael's converted garage, I'd been useful but not valued. Now that I had my own life and my own choices, I could engage with my family as an equal rather than as a subordinate. The movie was a romantic comedy about a woman who rediscovers herself after a divorce, and Elena and I laughed and cried together in the dark theater. Afterward, we went for coffee and talked about second chances and new beginnings, and the courage it takes to change your life after 60. "I'm proud of you," Elena said as we parted ways in the parking lot. "It takes real strength to rebuild your identity after you've been invisible for so long." "I'm proud of me too," I said, and realized I meant it. When I got home that night, I found a text message from Tyler. "Grandma Dot, can Emma and I come visit your apartment this weekend? Dad says it's okay if you want us to." I smiled and typed back, "I'd love that. We can go swimming and I'll teach you how to play poker." "Really? Really? But don't tell your parents about the poker until after you've learned to play." LOL. Okay. Love you, Grandma Dot. Love you too, sweetheart. I sat in my living room that night looking around at the space I'd created for myself and felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The apartment wasn't perfect, and my life wasn't perfect, but both were mine in a way that nothing had been mine for years. My phone buzzed with a notification from the book club group chat, where Margaret was already suggesting titles for next month's selection. I scrolled through the suggestions, adding my own vote for a biography about a woman who'd started a nonprofit organization at age 70. As I got ready for bed, I thought about the journey that had brought me to this point. It had started with a phone call to a landlord about a broken air conditioner, but it had become something much larger. A reclamation of my right to make decisions about my own life. The phone that Michael and Ashley had given me to keep me quiet had become the instrument of my liberation. Through it, I discovered information that changed my understanding of my situation, connected with resources that expanded my options, and found my voice in ways I'd forgotten were possible. But the real transformation hadn't been about technology or tenant rights or even independence. It had been about remembering that I was still a person with preferences and opinions and the capacity for growth. I'd spent 3 years living like someone whose story was over, whose only role was to be useful to other people. Now I was living like someone whose story was still being written, whose choices still mattered, whose voice still deserved to be heard. The woman who'd once managed a school cafeteria, who'd raised children and buried a husband and survived 68 years of life's challenges, was still here. She'd just been hiding under layers of diminished expectations and accepted limitations. The phone hadn't created her. It had simply reminded her that she still existed. At 68, I was finally learning to live at full size again, to take up the space I deserved, to speak with the voice I'd never lost but had temporarily forgotten how to use. And every morning when I woke up in my own apartment, in my own bed, with my own choices stretching out before me, I remembered that it's never too late to reclaim your life. The phone still sat on my nightstand, but it was no longer a tool someone else had given me to keep me occupied. It was my connection to the world, my research assistant, my camera for capturing moments I wanted to remember. It was whatever I chose to make it, just like my life was whatever I chose to make it. And that choice, I'd learned, was always mine to make. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.